Let me start by introducing David Leider to all out there. David is a longtime member, lifetime member of the Sioux Line Railroad Historical Society, as well as Historical and Technical Society, member of the B&O Historical Society, author of the book History of the Baltimore and Ohio Chicago Terminal, and that's available from the Historical Society bookstore. And while I'm mentioning the society, let me also broadly say that if you've enjoyed this mini-con and you're not a member, please consider joining. You know, several years ago, Bill Kramer, Ron Spiega, and I did an article here on Medina, the Baltimore, Ohio, and Medina. And one of the things that really I enjoyed on that article was the research about a little H.W. Madison Pickle Company that was located just to the west side of downtown Medina. And even Ron Spiega, who worked for the Baltimore and Ohio, will tell you stories of having to push sugar cars back up into the pickle facility. And we had an older engineer that was operating during the steam era who used to tell us a story about pushing vinegar cars up into there and parking the engine there, holding the engine while they uncoupled the car. And he said that he could reach over from the cab of the engine and lift the cover on the vats outside and grab a pickle. That might be a story like fishermen. How big was that fish? But that aside, I've always been intrigued by pickles, and David Leider is going to share with us some of the information and background about pickle facilities and modeling pickle plants. And on that, David, take it away, please.
Okay, before I start, I just, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I just wanted to say, you know, what would motivate a person to write a book about pickles? And the reason is that I'm a modeler and I have a pickle salting station on this in the city that I model. And I wanted to know how to model it and, you know, use it correctly. And I went to, you know, different train shows and asked, do you have any books on pickles? And they kind of looked at me like, no, there's no books on pickles. And I realized there weren't any books written on the pickle and vinegar industry. Now, there were some articles in, you know, MR and that sort of thing. I'm going to go to, see if I can share here. Here it is. But they didn't really tell you how it worked, how, you know, what cars came in and that sort of thing. So I thought it'd be an excellent opportunity. Oops, my cover slide's not here.
Ugh, shit.
Nope, going the wrong way. Here we go. All right. So I thought it'd be a good idea to write a book. So I started writing some articles. I wrote articles on building pickle cars, that sort of thing. And actually, when I was doing the history of the B&O Chicago Terminal, I was working on this pickle book also at the same time, and that came out before. So anyway, let's get started. All of my presentations, I like to have a little history and a little education, so you don't just start out looking at photographs. So you're going to have to bear with me and you're going to have to learn something. So pickles have a long history. It was thought they were made as early as 2030 BC. And America was named for a pickle peddler, Amerigo Vespucci. The modern pickle industry had its start in the 1850s in Chicago and New York. Prior to that, all the pickles were imported from Europe. And by the 1870s, Chicago led the United States in pickle manufacture. Now, making pickles is a two-step process, starting with cucumbers grown by farmers in the outlying areas. And then the first step is your salting. And you do the salting to preserve the cucumber. And at that time, it becomes a pickle. Many companies were only salters, and they sold their salted stock to the distributors, who then processed it or would sell it to another distributor. And what salting does, it removes the water. This is highly technical stuff here. Salting removes the water and some soluble nutrients from the cucumber through osmosis. And there's a good bacteria that produces lactic acid. That's what actually ferments the cucumbers. And the process takes about 4 to 6 weeks, depending on the temperature and other conditions. Unfortunately, there's what's called pickle scum yeast, and that uses the lactic acid produced by the desirable bacteria and produces a flat brine and basically spoils the pickles. And they found that sunlight inhibits the multiplication of the yeast. And that's why, if you ever wondered why pickle vats were open and outside, that's the reason, because the sunlight would basically keep the yeast down. And once properly fermented, the pickles are preserved in the brine and can be shipped as needed for the next step. And they were kept in the brine as long as they needed it. Once it was preserved, the brine kept them at the same state. And people ask, well, up north, doesn't the pickles freeze in the winter? And the brine,
No.
because of the high salt content, it kept them from freezing. So a lot of the companies up north in Wisconsin would ship in as late as December. Okay, once you have the salted pickle, they're cured by placing them in large tanks with cold water. Basically, you're trying to get the salt out of them. They let it stand 12 hours, the water's drained. They add fresh water and heat it to 130 degrees. And once cured, they're covered with 30-grain distilled vinegar, usually apple cider vinegar, and allowed to stand 3 days. And this is where vinegar comes into the pickling process. After standing in the first vinegar, they may be packed in cask barrels or kegs and shipped, or further processed in sweet or sour pickles. And dill pickles are made by adding dill during the salting. This is some early companies. Squire Dinghy, who was a very large company, was established in 1856. Bud Long, 1857. Heinz, which everybody knows, 69. Clausen, another popular still today, 1878. Reed Murdoch, they were more of a food distributor. Allart and McGuire, another food distributor. And even Libby, the packing house, Libby, McNeil and Libby, now it's Libby, were pickle packers. This is Squire Dinghy in Chicago. This is his pickle cucumber field. Here he's picking the cucumbers. Here's a check for some pickles he purchased. He won an award at the Philadelphia Centennial in 1876 for his pickles because of the quality. And this shows that they were packed in barrels for sale, retail sales, small or medium, small, and gherkins, which are the smallest. And this is how they sold pickles back in the turn of the century, in display cases in these glass vats. And here's how he delivered his pickles. They would go from where he processed them to the retail stores in a little wagon like this. Chicago had a fire in 1871, and most of the pickle companies in Chicago were inside the city limits, and the fire basically destroyed their operations. So it forced the manufacturers to rebuild. And there was a gentleman named William Archdeacon, and he went to Crystal Lake, which I'll show you where it is. It's northwest of Chicago in McHenry County. And he established the Crystal Lake Canning and Preserving Company in 1872. And the success of this company started a rush by every town to have a pickle factory. At that time, all these little towns were very, very competitive and very, very jealous of each other. So if one town had something that was a success, every town tried to emulate their success. So soon, all these little towns up in Lake County or McHenry County had a pickle factory. And the thing is, they were all served by the Chicago and Northwestern. And this is McHenry County. This is the Wisconsin, Illinois border. But all these little towns had pickle factories. And this shows McHenry County in relationship to Chicago. And you can see that this is Chicago Northwestern, went right into Chicago, and the Squire Dinghy's main factory was along the Northwestern. I'll show photos later. And this is the Crystal Lake was over here, and actually the town was called Nunda. And the pickle factory was here. And this is a drawing of the factory. You can see it's a very, very large operation. This was the largest pickle factory in the world at that time. Very successful. Unfortunately, Mr. Archdeacon was somewhat of a scoundrel, and the company went bankrupt. But moving way ahead, 70 some years, this is 1942, and it shows where the majority of the cucumbers grown for pickles in the United States were grown. And you can see Michigan and Wisconsin grew the majority of the cucumbers for pickles. Michigan had 33,000 acres. Wisconsin had 14,400. And then you had varied amounts. Naturally, the Sun Belt was good for growing cucumbers, but not necessarily for salting. They found that salting was done best in the cooler temperatures in Wisconsin and Michigan. Once another map of Michigan, this just shows in what counties most of the cucumbers were grown. You can see most of it is along the lake, and then they were shipped to Chicago, except for the salting stations that belonged to Heinz, H.J. Heinz, which was in Pennsylvania. They would go to Pennsylvania. A similar map of cucumber acreage in Wisconsin. Big concentration up here around Green Bay. This area was considered the best pickle area, somewhat around closer to Chicago. And this is the distribution of cucumber pickle varieties. They found that another reason that the salters moved out of Illinois is that they kept using or growing cucumbers on the same plot of ground year after year after year. And as anyone who knows, once you overcrop land, it declines in productivity. And there were a number of diseases and insects that really attacked the pickle plants, so that they developed different seeds. The University of Michigan was in the forefront of developing seeds specifically for growing good cucumbers. So these were the varieties You notice Heinz Pickling and Chicago Pickling are two of the names. So, and the salters, the companies that would do the salting would hire the farmers to grow cucumbers for them, and they would supply them with the seeds so that they were all using the same variety. As far as the salting stations, there were two types, closed and open. And I took a map of Wisconsin and I highlighted where highlighted every city that grew cucumbers in 1927-28. There were 87 pickle companies. And that was an increase of 21 more than a couple of years prior. And as far as the big names, Heinz had 12, Squire Dingy had 8, Libby 6, Gedney, which was a Minnesota concern, 5, and Bond, which was near Green Bay, had 3. Anyway, every single salting station was on the railroad except for this one here that was not. So that's shows the importance of the railroads in the production of pickles. And the way it was done is the company would build a salting station, or put an advertisement in the paper, I should say, that they were going to build a salting station. And then they would contract with the farmers to supply cucumbers. And the better cucumbers were the smaller ones. So 3.5 inch and smaller, you got $3 per 100 pounds. And then a little less for the bigger sizes, and nubs were considered the ones that were misshapen or weren't up to standard. And it says here they have rented of the Sioux Line land west of Mr. Lotz's potato warehouse in which to build. The problem was there already was a salting station. Squire Dingy had a salting station in Sheridan. And there was kind of a gentleman's agreement that if there was already a salting station in a city, you wouldn't go in and try to steal their farmers. So even though they said they made arrangements, this salting station was never built. Excuse me. And this is a closed salting station. And there's a couple of distinguishing features for all the, no matter if they're closed or open, they all had a big tank for water, because you needed a lot of water for the salting. But otherwise, it just looks like a typical industrial building with a water tank. And this, it's hard to tell from this photo, but this is where they unload it right here. Here's another pickle factory, colorized photo or postcard. Here's the boxcar. Coloma, Michigan. They also made their own vinegar. These two vats are vinegar vats, and this is the water for the pickle vats. Scotts, Michigan. Once again, here's your water tank and here's your siding. Thayer, Michigan. And here's open salting stations. And like I said, open stations meant they weren't covered. So the sunlight would inhibit the pickle scum yeast. And here's two gentlemen. You can see the size of the vats in comparison to two gentlemen here. And the salt and tools were kept in this little building. And the olive casks were used for the first salting, because if there weren't enough cucumbers to fill a vat, it didn't make much sense to just use half a vat. So they used these big kegs for salting. Here's kind of an aerial view of a typical salting station. This one is closed, if you notice. They keep them closed when they're not being used. This is Marshall Tanayo. I love this photograph. This would be a nice scene to model with the overturned wheelbarrow, probably the agent's car here. The yard was in the back here. Here's barrels. Barrels were used for salting the early crop or for making dill pickles. They made dill pickles in barrels because they needed to be turned and mixed up. The ingredients had to be mixed. And the best way to do it was to put it in a barrel, put the barrel on its side, and then just roll it when it needed to be mixed. Here's the reverse of that pickle station. Here's one in Westfield. Once again, a number of barrels, smaller barrels, larger barrels. Again, always lots of barrels. Here's a Squire Dinghy station. Wittenberg, Wisconsin. And Willard, Wisconsin. You can see all the barrels lined up here. This is a smaller operation, but once again, you've got your big tank here for water, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, looks like about 8 or 9 tanks. And here's your dill pickles underneath. This was abandoned. This was in Red Granite, Wisconsin. It was abandoned when I took the photo. Okay, after salting, the next step is freshening, and that was done in a factory setting. And this is Green Bay Foods in Green Bay, and the thing is, it's built in the Y of the Green Bay and Western yard. There was a grain elevator here, and here's all the vats for salting. And here's Charles Safi, and he's taking a pickle out of the, here the water is being boiled to get the salt out, and he's sampling one of his pickles. This is the Squire Dinghy factory in Chicago. The photographer was undoubtedly taking a picture of the Clybourne Street Depot on the Chicago Northwestern, but he did manage to capture a corner of the factory. And here's a couple of boxcars that are probably used for the finished goods. And here's another photo, and this shows all the pickle cars lined up to be unloaded and made into or packaged into pickles. Once again, here's the Clybourne Street station. This is the Libby, McNeil and Libby plant. This is the front. In the rear, you can see all the pickle cars. And the pickling operation was done on the top floor. So the pickles kind of took a trip up this elevator to the top here. Bond Pickle Company in Oconto. This is Heinz's factory in Holland, and the next series of photos will show how this grew over the years. This became their largest factory for packing pickles. Here's a 1902 Sanborn map. It's here, and then you've got some salting houses here. And they also had a vinegar factory associated with it. Back in the early part of the 1900s, half of all vinegar made was used in pickling. Back then, it was mainly cider vinegar. The white vinegar, just that we know now, wasn't really popular with people. They liked the cider vinegar, but half of all the cider vinegar was used in making pickles. Here's a later map, how it's grown. (1925), grown again. And this is much later. This is, I believe, in the 80s. And I was interested in the pickling operation, and a friend of mine said, well, there's pickle plants up in Michigan that are still in use. Let's take a trip and we can go visit them. So we went to the Heinz plant here, and we parked in the parking lot here. You can't see it, but there's a guard tower here, or a watchman's tower, I guess, and the entrance here. So we, we're kind of brazen. So we walked up and said, hi, I'm doing a book on pickles. Do you mind if I walk around and take some pictures? And naturally, it didn't go over too well. We weren't allowed to go in and take pictures, but we tried. And by this time, you can see the vats are all made out of plastic. There's a few wooden vats left, but the majority of them are plastic. Just another view. Closer view. And this is preparing a tank of cucumbers for the salting operation. This was done inside, and they were salting inside. Here's a workman removing the pickle scum yeast from the closed vats inside. And all these barrels that are kind of in the way had dill pickles in them. And here's a lady packing pickles, putting them into bottles, which begs Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. Here's another colorized photo of the Libby, McNeil and Libby, where they're putting the pickles in the glass jars. And here's the warehouse getting ready for finished goods, ready for shipments. You can see they were all shipped out once again in barrels. Okay, as model railroaders, we're interested in transport. How did they get from the salting station to the freshening, and then from the freshening to the customer? Heinz, he was a very innovative person, and before he came along, all the cucumbers were shipped in barrels. So after they were salted, they were put in barrels and stacked in a boxcar and shipped to wherever they were freshened. And he saw this as kind of a waste of manpower and space. So he made a pickle car, the first one in 1894. It was 4 thick cypress staves, and it was kind of a box. And these boxes would go into a car, and they were called coffin cars because of the shape. And they were built by the Middleton Car Company of Middleton, Pennsylvania, who also built some cars for Clausen. In 1912, they started having steel underframes. And about this time, Heinz began building their own cars. And in 1925, Heinz came out with version 3. It was a closed side car, and the coffin look kind of disappeared. But here's his first car. Notice it's numbered number 19. He also had vinegar cars and refrigerator cars built before this. And he was big on advertising, so he would advertise anywhere he could. So he built this little like billboard, put his name on the side, put his name on the top. But you can see that there were these boxes inside this car. I'll show you a little later. Here's his Type 2 car, still advertising heavily, truss rod car. Here's a car being loaded at a pickle plant. They would open up the side or the top, and then the pickles would be dumped in. You can see the 3 vats. The pickles would be dumped in these vats. And here's a picture of the vats. They didn't take the vats out of the car and dump them. The pickles were scooped out of the vats with a dip net, and these enclosures, boxes, stayed in the car. But this is the this is the Heinz plant. You can see some vinegar tanks behind here. Here's one of his pickle cars, Type 2 pickle cars, and one of his pickle cars with the vats taken out, probably for repair. Again, a couple pickle cars. Here's the inside with the stencils for advertising. And here's his Type 3 car. And here's the vats. They were much larger by this time for the Type 3 cars. And this was, they built their own cars for a while, and then they went back to General American Transportation for cars. They got out of the car building business. Once again, two cars with Chicago Freight Car and Parts Companies supplied parts for it. And these lasted into the 60s. And Heinz also had the typical vat cars. Other early cars, the Middleton Car Works, I said, was an early builder. They went into receivership in 1908. Standard Steel Car Company purchased it in 1909. Pickle cars are also built by American Car and Foundry and General American Tank Car Company. And here's a early pickle car with an unusual underframe. This is Reed Murdoch and Company, and their brand name was Monarch Pickles. Keokuk Canning Company. This was similar to one of the coffin cars. This is the Clausen car, which was the same as the Heinz car, but unlike Heinz, they didn't put a banner on top there to advertise. Libby car. Libby had 51 pickle tank cars at one time, which is the same as they had refrigerator cars. So they were a big packer of pickles. Thrall car manufacturing ad, and they showing a pickle car. Squire Dinghy, they had the third largest fleet of cars at 15. They had a Brown Miller subsidiary who had another 11, and Lutz and Schramm, a company they bought out, had 4. So they had a big fleet of cars, and they used several different builders. Here's some of their cars. And you can see the hatches on top here where they loaded the pickles and unloaded them. And here it shows how they're loading the cars. Here's the vat. They would use dip nets to take the pickles, at this time they were pickles, out of the cars, load them into wheelbarrows, use this OSHA approved loading device here. Take your wheelbarrow, go over this plank, and then just dump them in the barrels. The barrels had already had brine in them, so that they were preserved, still being preserved. Another Squire Dinghy car. Their brand name was Ma Brown Pickles and Preserves. Here's their cars. I think they were afraid of car 113 because there never was a car 113. It was bought, or Squire Dinghy was bought by Budlong, and it became Green Bay Foods. And here's that grain elevator I showed you earlier in Green Bay. And here's a Green Bay food car, pickle car. Just some other companies. Here's Keokuk Canning Company. Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy had a couple of pickle cars, although they didn't list them in the equipment register as pickle cars. They were listed as flat cars. Sioux Line had a large fleet of pickle cars, and they were all in dedicated service to the Gedney Company in Minneapolis. And basically, they were old flat cars, and then the Gedney Company would supply the tanks, and then they would mount them on the flat car. Here's one in its later date. These are in the scrap line. And this one is a newer one, and it was photographed in Maine, getting a load of cucumbers or pickles to ship back to Minneapolis. So modeling, the salting stations were in all different sizes. I've seen a salting station with 3 vats, and then there's the huge ones like in Green Bay Foods. The vats were various size, but most of them were a standard size. They were frequently changed as the tanks were easily moved. If the farmers decided they were tired of growing cucumbers and there weren't enough cucumbers to keep a salting station going in a town, they would just move the whole factory. Just take the tanks apart and move them on to the next town. And inbound loads, there were 2 types of salt. There was a coarse salt that was used in the vats. And then there was what they called kosher salt, or a finer salt, and that was delivered in bags, and that was for the dill pickles. The coarse salt was just received in boxcars and shoveled out into the storeroom. You also needed dill. I have records of a whole car of dill going to a salting station to make dill pickles. So dill was delivered in boxcars. Barrels, of course, you need a lot of barrels. And maybe cucumbers from another area up in New York State. They ship cucumbers in boxcars from one station to the next, to the salting station. And the outbound loads were pickles in barrels or pickle cars. And this was a drawing of a pickle station in January 1955. Notice how the vats were tapered. This is incorrect. The vats were never tapered. They were always straight. So whoever drew this kind of used their own license to taper these vats. But it shows how here's the platform. The platform was always 6 feet high, and the vats were always 8 feet, I believe. Here's a Heinz car. Back in the 60s, Heinz made a brochure for modelers where they had a picture of some pickle cars and some vinegar cars, along with plans, and it included color swatches on correct colors to use for painting your car. Here's a Squire dinghy car, a drawing that I've made. This is a car I built, Sioux-line car on my former layout. This is an O-scale Squire dinghy car I built for a friend. Today, obviously, they're still making pickles today. A lot of the pickles are made cold process, where they just put the pickles and some spices and some vinegar in a jar and put in their ferment it that way, but they still do it the old-fashioned way. Fiberglass tanks are used. Genuine dills and original pickles are what are made the old-fashioned way in vats. This is the Freestone Pickle Company in Bangor, Michigan. They are no longer rail served, but you can see the fiberglass vats. They still have some wooden vats, but I don't believe they were being used. Here's containers for bringing the pickles from the fields. And this is the building that is still standing. And this is an old postcard that shows the building as it appeared in, I believe, about 1925. Employees standing on their two pickle cars. This is when the trip we took to Michigan. This is the Flams Company. It's not rail served, but they make all the pickle condiments that you find in all the fast food joints except for McDonald's. And they still use the wooden vats, although they have for freshening. They use the wooden vats for freshening. And you can see back here are the fiberglass. Oops, back here are the fiberglass vats for salting. And here's some cucumbers bobbing to the top. and they're freshening them up in this vat. They don't use dip nets anymore. They use this conveyor system that pulls the cucumber or the pickles out of the vats and onto the conveyor system. Oh, here's their vats. They're half buried in the ground to make it easier to, you don't need a platform. This is Bayside Foods in Green Bay, Wisconsin. That is where that inside the Y of the Green Bay and Western. And these are vats for making dill pickles. They still make dill pickles the old-fashioned way in vats. I took the picture through a chain link fence, so you can see the little chain link here. And they also have a lot of large vats for salting, small vats for salting and for dill pickles. And that is the end. And here's a pickle car on the lake shore in Michigan Southern. If you're interested in the book, here's some information. And let's see, I'll get out of this. Is there any questions?
I think Patty Smith asked a question while you had some dinghy photos up there of dinghy pickle cars, and she asked if they're preserved, if any of them have been preserved.
Yes, there's a pickle car. Let me think now. I know there's several vinegar cars. No, pickle cars, there's none. There was a few, but unfortunately they weren't, nobody took care of them and they rotted away. There might be one. I think there's one on somewhere in out in Colorado, but as far as I know, there are no pickle cars left.
Okay.
And there was a note from Bob that says, interested in the Dolly Madison Pickle Company. That was the H.W. Madison Pickle Company. That later was purchased by the Smucker Company, and they continued to make pickles until late 60s, early 70s there. So they would bring the pickles in from the farm field via truck, via rail traffic early on, but truck later on. And primarily rail traffic served for bringing sugar into that facility, as well as finished pickles out, but for the most part, it was delivery of sugar for bread and butter pickles.
Yeah, sweet pickles used a lot of sugar. And they were made after they were fermented, then they would make sweet pickles. And the first person to make sweet pickles was Heinz, and they advertised this new sweet pickle at the Columbian Exposition in 1893 in Chicago. And they said there was such a crowd of people. It was on the second floor of this whatever building they were in. And they said they were afraid that the floor was going to collapse because so many people wanted to get a free bread and butter, I think they called them, pickle.
Well, David, thank you very much for that interesting, fascinating look at pickle industry and how it's modeled and served by railroads. Again, certainly appreciate your time and your willingness to put this together for us and share it with us all.
Good. Glad you enjoyed it.
And on that note, that brings us to a close for the Western Minicon. Again, I want to thank all the presenters. We're very blessed by those people who take the time to put this together and then share it with us, and all the people that attended. I hope you enjoyed yourself. Again, please consider being a member of the Historical Society if you're not. And if you are, I hope you continue being one. Thank you all again, and thanks to everybody that facilitated this, Nick Fry, Al McAvoy, Andy White. Everybody,
And thank you, Mike, for your you also put some effort into this mini-con, a lot of effort.
always our pleasure to help the society out. You all take care. Enjoy your weekend.
Are there any remaining questions that haven't been asked? I know that's mentioned in the agenda at the end here at 3 o'clock.
Right.
Has anybody? I don't see any.
The only thing I'll mention now is I want people to give consideration to the meeting together in Akron. And if we all get vaccinated and I think things continue to progress, we should be able to have a pretty good physical meeting. And we'll take any steps. We'll take steps if we find that we need to be a little more careful on the buses, maybe wearing a mask on the buses if we have to. So.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
I'd like to address that. I deal with COVID families. Every Thursday night, we do a Zoom meeting. This has been going on for a year. And these are families who have actually lost their father, their mother, their brother, their sister. And I think what it's going to come down to after people are vaccinated is with the variants, if you want to choose to wear a mask, you do. And if you don't, you just don't. So as